On the morning of May 30th, 1879, the sky above Reed's Crossing, Kansas, turned the wrong color. It was not the gray of an ordinary storm. It was not the purple-black of a summer thunderhead building slow and honest from the west. It was yellow-green, the specific sickening yellow-green that old-timers on the plains could not describe in words, but felt in their stomachs, the color that made horses move to the far corners of their paddocks and stand there with their ears flat and their eyes showing white. The color that made cattle refuse to settle. The color that meant the sky had made a decision and was not asking for anyone's opinion about it. By 3:30 in the afternoon, two storm systems were moving toward Reed's Crossing from different directions. One from the southwest, one from the northwest. They were not moving toward each other the way storms usually did, merging and weakening as they traded energy. They were moving toward the settlement, toward the 14 structures that made up the only human outpost for 6 miles in any direction on that wide, flat, indifferent stretch of Marshall County prairie. 14 structures: frame cabins, sod shanties, a general store, a one-room schoolhouse with a sagging roof, a blacksmith shop that smelled of coal smoke and iron. 14 structures built by people who had bet everything on this land and had already lost more than they expected, and stayed anyway because staying was the only move left. The wind found all 14 of them. It applied the same force to each one. It did not choose favorites. It did not care who had worked harder or prayed longer or endured more. It found the walls and tested them according to the only law that mattered on the Kansas prairie in the spring of 1879, which was the law of physics, which was merciless and exact and did not negotiate. 13 of those structures answered the wind the way wood answers wind, which is to say they came apart. One of them did not. That one had been built by a 19-year-old girl with $7.40 a hand axe in 41 days. It had been built by someone the settlement had decided was not worth helping, not worth feeding, not worth the wood it would cost to keep her warm through one Kansas winter. It had been built by someone who, 8 months before the tornadoes came, had stood in the dark outside a closed door and counted what she had left and decided it was enough. Her name was Nora Crane. This is her story, and it begins not in the wreckage of May, but in the quiet of the previous April, when she was just a girl walking west before sunrise with worn-through boots and a plan as thin as paper, and a stubborn refusal to accept the arithmetic that everyone else in Marshall County had already worked out for her. The sun was not yet up when Nora Crane crossed the wooden bridge over the Big Blue River and entered the settlement of Reed's Crossing for the first time. She had been walking since before 4 in the morning. The road from the east, if you could call it a road which was generous, was a dirt track that turned to mud and rain and to powder and wind and to something close to glass in the hard freezes of December. And on this particular Wednesday morning in late April of 1878, it would merely rutted and gray and long. Her boots had worn through at the left heel sometime in the previous 2 days. She could feel the road through the sole with each step, not painfully yet, but she knew what came after that. She did not stop to rest at the bridge. She paused on it for a moment, looked down at the river running fast and brown with spring melt, then looked west toward the settlement, then kept walking. Reed's Crossing was not much to look at in the early morning light. 14 homesteads scattered across a wide bend of the Big Blue, connected by a single dirt track that served as the settlement's only street, though no one would have called it that. A general store with a porch that leaned slightly to the south. A blacksmith shop, a one-room schoolhouse, frame cabins and sod shanties set back from the track at intervals, some with smoke already rising from their chimneys into the cold April air, some still dark. The settlers had come in waves. The first wave in 1871, when the land looked flat and fertile, and the railroad handbills promised rain enough to grow wheat. They had stayed through years that broke those promises. Most of them had buried someone. All of them owed money to the store. Nora had not been invited to Reed's Crossing. No one was expecting her. But she had heard in the county east of here that a man named August Draper was short a hired hand going into planting season, and August Draper had 160 acres of wheat and a team of horses and enough work for 2 people, and Nora needed a place to earn wages for 2 years, and nothing more complicated than that. The plan, such as it was simple to the point of being almost foolish. She was 19 years old. The Homestead Act required a claimant to be 21 or the head of a family. She was neither. She had no family. She had no land. She had no one in Marshall County who knew her name. What she had was sewn into the lining of her left boot, $3,160 saved over 3 years of hired work in Missouri and eastern Kansas. And what she had in the other boot was a planned 2 years of work at whatever wages Draper paid, keep her head down, save what she could on top of what she already had, and file a homestead claim on the day she turned 21. 2 years, 160 acres, a life that was hers and owed nothing to anyone. It was a plan as thin as paper. She knew it. A single bad season, a single broken bone, a single employer who decided to stop paying, and the whole thing collapsed. But it was a plan, and she had been living by plans since she was 12 years old and learned that the alternative to having a plan was having nothing at all. She found Draper at his barn before breakfast. He was a tall, angular man in his mid-40s with a disposition that ran cold in the mornings and colder in the evenings, which she would learn later. But in that first meeting, he simply looked at her the way a man looks at an unexpected tool, assessing whether it would do the job. He did not ask where she was from. On the frontier, that question had too many uncomfortable answers, and a man who asked it too quickly was a man who thought it mattered, and a man who thought it mattered was usually a man who had never needed anything badly enough to stop asking. Draper had needed badly enough. He asked what she could do. She told him. He told her what it paid. $18 a month board included sleep in the loft of the barn. She took it. She shook his hand and moved into the barn that afternoon, and the next morning she was up before Draper himself, working the fence line along the east pasture before the sun cleared the horizon. This was not performance. This was calculation. She understood something that a lot of people in difficult circumstances understand, and that comfortable people sometimes mistake for stubbornness. The only way to hold a position you have no real claim to is to make yourself indispensable before anyone thinks to question whether you belong there. Nora had no contract beyond Draper's word. She had no legal standing in Reed's Crossing, no kin to speak for her, no reputation that preceded her. What she had was the ability to work harder than anyone expected and to do it without being asked and to do it again the next day. So she did. Through the spring planting and the long heat of the Kansas summer, she mended fence and mucked stalls and hauled water from the river and cut hay alongside Draper's two farmhands. Both of them men 10 years older than her, who had learned quickly that she was faster with a scythe than either of them, and had decided after a week of testing that she ignored entirely to simply work beside her and say nothing about it. She was good with a post-hole digger. She had strong hands from 3 years of outdoor work and a tolerance for discomfort that she had developed so gradually it no longer felt like tolerance. It just felt like life. She ate what Mrs. Draper set out at the table and said little beyond what was necessary and listened to everything. This was another thing she had learned, that listening cost nothing and told you more than asking. At the table, she heard about Conrad Vane, who owned the general store and held credit lines for 8 of the 14 homesteads in the settlement, which meant he held a lever over 8 families' winters and pulled it just enough to keep them owing and not enough to break them entirely. Because a man who understood credit understood that a debtor who survived was more valuable than one who didn't. She heard about Solomon Hatch, who had come to Marshall County in 1871 with 2 mules and a wife and $140, and had buried his wife in the fever year of 1876 and his youngest boy in the blizzard of 1877, and who had 12 Kansas winters under his belt, and whose opinion at the rare community meetings was treated as settled fact. She heard about Everett Goss, 22 years old, who had filed a homestead claim the previous year with $90 and a wagon load of lumber hauled from Marysville, and who had what people called a carpenter's eye, meaning he could look at a structure and tell you in 30 seconds where it would fail. She heard all of this and said nothing, and went back to the barn at night and lay on her blanket in the loft and counted the days toward the goal that no one in Reed's Crossing knew she had. June passed, July passed. The wheat grew and was cut, and Draper sold most of it and kept some and paid his debt to Vane's store and had less left than he wanted, which was true of every farmer in Reed's Crossing in every year she would ever hear about. August arrived with heat that sat on the prairie like a hand pressing down and made the work slower and the tempers shorter and the water in the river lower and browner. Through all of it, Nora watched. She watched the way Draper responded to a problem, first with silence, then with blame, almost never with a solution that required him to accept any portion of responsibility. She watched the way Vane moved through the settlement on his monthly rounds, not hostile, not friendly, simply present in the way of a man who knows everyone owes him something and finds that knowledge more comfortable than people should. She watched Solomon Hatch, who lived 2 farms north of Draper and who moved through Reed's Crossing like a man who has earned the right to move slowly, measured, and deliberate, wasting nothing. She was building a map, not of the land, though she was building that too. A map of the people, of who could be trusted and who could be tolerated and who needed to be understood before they became a problem. On the frontier, people were either resources or obstacles, and the difference between surviving and not surviving was knowing which was which before you needed to know. September came. September was when the map stopped mattering. It rained on a Monday night in the first week of September. Fast rain, the kind that comes out of a clear sky and fills a dry creek bed in 30 minutes. Nora had checked Draper's east fence line 2 days before the rain and found it solid. She had checked it because that was her job, and she did her job without being told, which was the only basis she had for being there. By Tuesday morning, 3 of Draper's cattle were gone. The east fence had a section down, washed out or pushed through in the night, and the draw along the eastern edge of the property had flooded and taken the cattle into the creek. Draper found 2 of them a mile downstream, dead on a gravel bar. The third was never found. He told Nora to pack her things. She stood in the yard and said that the fence had been solid when she checked it 2 days prior. She said it calmly because she knew that calm was the only register available to her in that moment. Not anger, which would confirm whatever he had already decided. Not pleading, which would make her smaller in a situation where she could not afford to be any smaller. Just the facts stated once clearly. Draper said he didn't care. 3 head of cattle was 3 head of cattle, and someone had to answer for it, and the someone in front of him was her. He had no contract to break. He had a word that he had given, and now he was giving a different word, and on the Kansas frontier in 1878, a hired hand with no kin and no deed and no one to speak for her had no recourse beyond the word of the man who hired her. His word was done. She asked about September's wages. She had worked 15 days of the month and was owed $9. He said the cattle had cost more than the wages and walked inside. She stood in the yard with her wool blanket rolled under her arm and her hand axe and her skinny knife and her small supply of personal goods and watched the door close. She did not move for a moment. Not because she was stunned. She had understood since she was 12 years old that the world did not owe her fairness and would not be providing it. She stood still because she was thinking, and thinking required stillness. Then she picked up her bundle and walked to the general store. Conrad Vane was behind the counter when she came in. He was 45 years old, heavy-set with close-cropped gray hair and the deliberate, unhurried manner of a man who had not been surprised by anything in a long time and had decided that surprise was a form of inefficiency. He held the credit lines for 8 families in this settlement. He had lived in Reed's Crossing since 1873, 2 years after the first wave of settlers, and he had arrived not with a homestead dream, but with capital and a ledger and a clear understanding of what people needed when they couldn't afford to need it. He was not a cruel man. She understood this almost immediately. Cruelty required a kind of passion that Vane had long since traded in for something more useful. He was a man who had worked out the logic of his own survival and followed it with the consistency of arithmetic. And the logic said that credit was only as good as the collateral behind it, and collateral required something real, land, livestock, a structure, a name that the county knew. Nora Crane had none of those things. She had come to Reed's Crossing 3 months ago as Draper's hired hand, and she had left Draper's employment this morning under circumstances that Draper had apparently already described to Vane, because when she explained what she needed, Vane looked at her the way a man looks at a note he has already decided not to honor. Draper has told me what happened, Vane said. She said she needed a credit line for basic supplies. She said she planned to find hired work elsewhere in the county and would pay it back before the first freeze. He said he didn't extend credit to a person who had cost an employer 3 head of cattle and walked away from the debt. She said she hadn't walked away from anything. She said she had been pushed out without wages owed. Vane looked at her with an expression that was not unkind and not interested. Same result, he said, and turned back to his ledger. She stood at the counter for a moment longer than was comfortable. Not because she expected him to change his mind, but because she was working out the next step, and the next step required her to know exactly where she stood. She stood at a counter in a settlement that had just closed every door it had to close, without anger, without drama, simply by following its own logic. She was a 19-year-old girl with no kin and no land and no contract and no one in Marshall County who owed her anything. That was the arithmetic. That was the ground she was standing on. She spent the remainder of her money on what she needed most: 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of salt pork, 5 pounds of coffee, salt, dried beans, a tin pot, a length of rope. She counted out the coins on Vane's counter and watched him note the transaction in his ledger with the practiced efficiency of a man who had stopped seeing the people behind the numbers. She left with $7.40. That evening, she walked to the homestead of Solomon Hatch and knocked on his door. Hatch answered it himself. He was a large man broad across the shoulders with a gray beard and the kind of face that had been worked on by weather for a long time and had stopped fighting it. His eyes were steady and careful, the eyes of a man who had learned to measure things before he committed to them. He had 2 living children, a daughter of 11 named Ruth and a boy of 8 named Thomas, and he had fed them through 12 Kansas winters on a combination of hard work and careful arithmetic and the stubbornness that the prairie seemed to produce in the people who stayed on it long enough. He looked at her on his doorstep in the evening light and said nothing for a moment. It was not the silence of a man who didn't know what he thought. It was the silence of a man doing arithmetic. She told him she was looking for a place to sleep until she found work. Not food, not charity. Just a corner of his barn until she had somewhere else to go. He looked at her for 3 full seconds before he answered. She counted them. She had time. She was not going to fill that silence with anything because she understood that whatever he was calculating in those 3 seconds was real, was honest, was the result of 12 winters and a buried wife and a buried child and resources that had exact limits, and she owed it to him to let him finish the calculation. "I have 300 pounds of flour," he said finally. 40 bushels of corn, enough firewood to last until March if I burn careful. That's for me and my 2 children. There is nothing left over for a girl with no claim and no kin." His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man stating a fact that he wished were different and had accepted was not. He started to close the door, then stopped. "I'm not telling you this to be hard," Hatch said. "I'm telling you because you're 19 years old and you don't know what you're walking into. The first hard freeze comes in 8 weeks, maybe less. A person without shelter in this county in December doesn't last to January. When they find her, there won't be a soul here who owes her a burial." He paused. "There's a settlement near Marysville that takes on hands in the fall. Ride north. You might find a place to winter there." She said she didn't have a horse. Hatch looked at her. Then he closed the door. She stood on his porch in the dark and listened to the sound of the door settling into its frame and the sound of the prairie wind moving through the tall grass and the sound of nothing else. She walked back toward the settlement. She did not go to anyone else's door. She had mapped this settlement and she knew what she had just learned, which was that the map had run out. There was no other door to knock on. Draper had fired her. Vane had closed his ledger. Hatch had shut his barn. The logic of the settlement was not cruel. It was simply the logic of people who had nothing to spare and could not afford to share what they did not have with someone who had no legitimate claim on them. She understood this. Understanding it did not make it less of a wall. She sat down on the steps of the general store, which was closed and dark, and she counted what she had. $7.40. A hand axe, a skinny knife, a wool blanket, a length of rope, 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of salt pork, 5 pounds of coffee salt dried beans, a tin pot. Enough food to last, if she was careful, perhaps 6 weeks. The first hard freeze in Marshall County came on average between the 8th and 15th of November. That was documented. It was the 24th of September. She had 41 days. She sat on those steps and worked out the arithmetic the way she had worked out every hard calculation since she was 12 years old, not by hoping the numbers were different than they were, but by accepting the numbers exactly as they were and then looking at what was left. Not what was comfortable, not what was fair, what was real. A frame shanty, just one room 8 by 10 feet, cost $25 in lumber minimum. The nearest lumber yard was in Marysville, 3 days walk each direction. She did not have $25. She did not have the 6 weeks it would take to walk there and back and build something before the freeze. A sod house cost less under $20 in materials, but required a breaking plow to cut the blocks, and she did not own a plow, and more importantly, required land. The Homestead Act was clear on this. A claimant had to be 21 years old or the head of a family. She was neither. She had no legal claim to a single square foot of Kansas soil. She could not build a sod house on land she did not own and could not legally claim. No money for lumber, no plow for sawston, no land to build on, no time to solve any of the three before the freeze arrived and made all of it irrelevant. She sat on those steps in the September dark with the wind moving across the prairie and the lamplight showing in the windows of the houses whose doors had been closed to her, and she looked at the arithmetic and she did not cry. She had cried when she was younger, when she still believed that the world sometimes responded to that. She had learned that it didn't. What the world responded to was not emotion but action, and she had no action to take yet, so she sat and thought. She thought for a long time. Then she lay down on the store porch with her blanket pulled around her, and she went to sleep because she had learned that exhaustion made problems larger than they were, and she needed the problems to be exactly the size they were, no bigger. 6 days later, she found the silo. She had been working the river bottom 2 miles south of the settlement every day since the store porch gathering, driftwood and deadfall from the cottonwood stands along the bank. It was slow work. Cottonwood was softwood. It burned fast and threw less heat than oak or hickory, and she needed far more of it than the river had to offer in any short stretch. But she had no money for firewood and no way to cut timber from land that wasn't hers, and the river was what she had. So she worked it methodically upstream and then downstream, pulling sections of trunk and branch through the brush and stacking them in a rough pile on a slight rise above the floodline. She had no structure to put the wood next to yet. She was stacking firewood for a shelter that did not exist. This would have looked like madness to anyone watching. She did not have the luxury of appearing sensible. She had the arithmetic wood needed to be cut and cured before the freeze, and the freeze was now 35 days out, and if she waited until she had a structure to stack the wood against, she would not have enough wood when the structure was finished. So she cut wood in the mornings and thought about the structure problem in the afternoons and tried not to think too hard about the fact that she had not yet solved it. She was dragging a section of cottonwood trunk through a tangle of river brush on the fourth morning when she stepped around a stand of tall grass and stopped. She saw it from 40 feet away and stood still for a moment, simply looking at it the way you look at something that does not fit the landscape it is sitting in. It was a circular structure, stone walls roughly 10 feet tall, running straight up from the ground to an open sky. No roof, a rectangular opening facing east, the lintel stone still in place above it. The interior visible through the opening was a cylinder of shadow and dead grass. The stone was pale and close-grained, the fence post limestone that ran in a geological band across north-central Kansas, named for the fence posts settlers cut from it when timber was scarce. It was not what the limestone looked like that stopped her. It was the walls themselves. She set down the cottonwood section and walked toward the opening. The walls were thick. She pressed her palm flat against the outer surface and spread her fingers as wide as they would go, and she could not feel the interior side. They were close to 20 inches across, maybe more, laid with lime mortar that had gone gray and crumbly in places but held. Each course of stone was roughly 8 inches thick and laid level, and the mortar between the courses was crumbling at the surface but had not failed internally, meaning the water had not gotten through, and the freeze-thaw cycles of 8 Kansas winters had not split the bond. 8 years. The structure had been standing for 8 years without a roof. She stepped inside. The floor was packed, earth matted with dead grass, and the residue of something that had once been grain. A thin root had worked its way through a crack in one of the lower stones on the west side. The crack had not gone far. The walls were plumb. She stepped to the center of the cylinder, which was 14 feet across, and looked up at the circle of sky overhead and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 6 days, which was the very early edge of something that was not quite hope, but was in the same family. She stepped outside and put her back against the east-facing wall. The wind stopped. Wind, not reduced, not slowed, stopped. The same westerly air that had been pushing at her coat and her hair and her face all morning split at the curved stone surface and rejoined behind the structure without ever finding the interior. The physics of it were simple and she understood them immediately. A curved surface has no flat face for wind pressure to push against. The force arrives at the wall on a tangent and splits half going left and half going right, flowing around the curve and meeting again on the far side. There is no corner where the pressure can double, no flat plane where the full force of the wind can press like a hand against a wall. The opening faced east, away from the prevailing west and northwest weather. Whoever had built this structure and then abandoned it had placed the door exactly right. She stood with her back against that east wall in the wind-quiet interior and looked at the stone cylinder and began for the first time in 6 days to do a different kind of arithmetic. The walls were already built. Someone else had done that work. 40 tons of limestone stacked and mortared and left standing through the locust plague of 1874, through the blizzard of 1877, through the hail and wind, and the endless freeze-thaw cycles of 8 Kansas winters, and the walls had not moved. The floor was already enclosed. 154 square feet of sheltered ground, more space than most settlers' root cellars. She needed 3 things to turn this cylinder into a place where a person could survive a Kansas winter: a roof, a stove, and enough mortar to seal the gaps in the walls. She did not have the money for any of those things, but she looked at the wall in front of her and understood something. The limestone that made the walls could be burned to produce quicklime. Quicklime slaked with water and then mixed with river sand made mortar. She had the river for sand and for water. She had cottonwood for fuel. She had clay banks downstream for chinking the wider gaps. And 3 miles east, in the ruins of an abandoned dugout she had passed 2 days before, there was a small cast-iron cook stove, rusted and left behind by whoever had given up on this county and gone back east or gone farther west or simply gone. For the roof, she needed cottonwood poles from the river bottom, a center post, radio rafters, bundles of prairie grass laid over the frame, and strips of sod cut and laid over the grass in overlapping courses. Every dugout and sod house in Reed's Crossing used a version of this method. She had watched it done. She had never done it herself. She had never built anything larger than a section of fence rail in her life. She thought about the land question. The structure had been built by a homesteader who abandoned his claim during the locust plague of 1874. When a homesteader abandoned a claim before proving up, the land reverted to the federal government, not to a county auction buyer, not to a neighboring farmer who thought he might as well use it, to the federal government, which meant it was public land, which meant that while she could not legally claim it under the Homestead Act for 2 more years, she could legally occupy it in the way that any person could occupy public land without formal claim. She had nothing. This was not nothing. She sat down on the weed-covered floor and looked at the circle of sky overhead for a long time. Then she stood up, picked up her hand axe, and started clearing dead grass from the floor. Everett Goss found her there the following morning. He had been riding the river bottom, checking his lower pasture fence, and he heard the sound of the axe before he saw her, a steady, rhythmic sound that did not fit the noise profile of a riverbank in early October. He came through the cottonwoods on horseback and stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the stone cylinder for a moment, and then at the girl working inside it, and then he dismounted. He was 22 years old. He had filed his homestead claim the previous year at the minimum age with $90 and a wagon load of lumber his father had fronted him from a sawmill in Iowa, and he had the direct, unhurried manner of a young man who had not yet learned to be diplomatic about what he saw. He walked around the exterior of the cylinder, examining the walls, pressing his own hand against the stone, the way she had, looking at the mortar joints and the base course in the east-facing opening. He came back and stood in the doorway. "You're going to live in a grain bin," he said. It was not quite a question. "It's the only structure in Marshall County I can legally occupy," she said. He looked at the walls for another moment. He was doing the same thing she had done the previous morning. She could see it running the arithmetic, assessing the stone, working out the load paths and the failure points. He had a carpenter's eye, and he was not wasting it. The man who built that Goss said finally couldn't make it work as a farm, left it standing in a floodplain, and walked away. "What makes you think you can make it work as a house?" She showed him the walls, the thickness of the stone, the way the curve killed the wind. She demonstrated it, standing at the opening with the westerly air moving past them, then stepping inside to where the air was still. She explained the roof she planned to build: center post, crossbeam, radial rafters of cottonwood poles, layered prairie grass bundles with sod over the top. She explained the lime burning process for making mortar and where she planned to get the clay for chinking the wider gaps in the location of the abandoned stove 3 miles east. Goss listened to all of it without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he shook his head slowly. "That roof is going to be a problem," he said. "Spanning 14 feet with cottonwood poles, green wood, no milled lumber. The weight of the sod alone could bring the whole thing down on your head. I've worked out the load," she said, which was not entirely accurate. "You worked it out with what?" "You've never built a roof," she looked at him. "I've never frozen to death either," she said. "I'm trying to keep that record intact." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the walls again. His expression was not dismissive. It was the expression of a man looking at a structural problem he cannot immediately solve and admitting that fact to himself. "I think you're going to die in that silo," he said. His voice was flat and honest and not unkind. "But I also can't tell you where else you're going to go." He mounted his horse. He stopped before he rode out of the clearing without turning around. "If you want to borrow my post hole digger for the center post, come by this afternoon." Then he rode north through the cottonwoods, and the sound of his horse faded into the wind. She stood in the doorway of the stone cylinder and listened to the silence that followed him out. She did not know whether he had helped her or simply confirmed what she already knew. Both were possible. Both might be true. But he had offered the post hole digger, and she would need the post hole digger, and she had learned a long time ago to take the tool that was offered without spending time analyzing the motivation behind the offer. She went back inside and kept clearing the floor. By the end of that first week, word had moved through Reed's Crossing, the way words always move through small settlements, which was to say fast and imprecisely. Conrad Vane heard it from the blacksmith who had heard it from Goss, who had said nothing to anyone about the post hole digger, but had mentioned the silo. By the time the story reached Vane, it had accumulated the specific texture that stories get when they pass through enough people who want them to mean something. A girl was squatting in an abandoned grain silo in the river bottom, 2 miles south, apparently planning to winter there, which everyone agreed was either brave or stupid, or most likely both. The phrase that attached to her was not flattering. "Silo girl," said with the particular tone that small communities use for things they expect to fail without needing to do anything to make them fail. The school teacher, a Swedish woman named Clara Swenson, who had come to Reed's Crossing the previous year with her 4-year-old son Eric and had found the settlement smaller than the advertisement had suggested, but had stayed because she had nowhere else practical to go, told her oldest student that the situation seemed unjust. Then in the same breath, she told the child not to say anything about it where Vane might hear. Because in Reed's Crossing in 1878, Conrad Vane's credit lines were the architecture of winter survival, and a person who openly sympathized with someone Vane had refused was a person who might find that architecture suddenly less available. Nora heard about the phrase when Goss mentioned it in passing when she came to return his post hole digger. He said it the way you say something to warn someone not to wound them. She thanked him for the tool and walked back south. She had 31 days left. She had not yet started the roof. The walls were 40% sealed. The stove was 3 miles east, sitting in the ruins of a dugout, rusting and waiting. Her food supply was dropping by a small but real amount every day. The firewood she had stacked on the rise above the floodline was a fraction of what she would need. She did not allow herself to look at all of it at once. She had learned that about hard problems, looking at the whole thing at once was the fastest way to stop moving. You could see the entire distance between where you stood and where you needed to be and be paralyzed by it, or you could look at the next foot of ground in front of you and take a step and then look at the next foot and take another step. The distance was the same either way. Only one of those approaches got you there. She looked at the next foot of ground. The stove had to come first. She laid down her axe on the silo floor and walked east. It was Conrad Vane who came to the silo on a gray October morning, 12 days after she had moved in, and he did not come alone. He came with August Draper on his left and Leander Holt, a corn farmer from the eastern edge of the settlement, on his right. All three of them on horseback, and they stopped at the edge of the clearing. Vane sat his horse the way a man sits when he has decided something and come to say it and wants the geography of the moment to say it for him, which was from above on horseback in the presence of witnesses. Nora was inside the cylinder when she heard the horses. She was covered in white dust from lime mortar work. She came out through the east doorway and stood in front of it. She looked at the three of them and waited. "I've been looking into the title on this land," Vane said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper and held it up without unfolding it. He had purchased the original homesteader's relinquishment rights at a county tax auction in 1875, $3.50, that he said gave him ownership of this land and everything on it. He looked at her over the folded paper, including that stone tube you were squatting in. She looked at the paper. She looked at his face. She thought about what she knew, which was not much, but was precise. When a homesteader abandoned a claim before proving up the land reverted to the federal government, a relinquishment meant the original claimant gave up his rights. It did not automatically create new rights in a secondary buyer at a county auction. The General Land Office in Washington might agree with Vane's interpretation of that document, or it might not, and there was no way to know without going to a federal court, which was not in Marysville and not in Marshall County. "You can file a trespass complaint with the county court in Marysville," she said. Vane's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A small recalibration. "I intend to," he said. "The court convenes in December," she said. "By December, either I'll be dead of cold or I'll have a structure worth arguing about. Either way, we'll know something." She stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides and her face calm and white with lime dust. She was aware of Draper watching her. She was aware of Holt looking at the river rather than at her, which told her something. A man who looks at the river during a confrontation is a man who doesn't entirely want to be there. Vane looked at her the way he looked at a debt he was not sure was collectible. He looked at Draper. Draper looked at Holt. Holt looked at the river. Then Vane turned his horse. "You have 2 weeks," he said over his shoulder. He rode north without filing the complaint. The calculation, she understood, was simple. A full day's round trip to Marysville, an uncertain legal outcome, a December court date, and a 19-year-old girl who might well solve the problem for him by not surviving to January. Attrition was cheaper than litigation. But the two men behind him had heard every word, and by evening the settlement knew what had been said. And what had been said was that the silo girl had told Conrad Vane to go to court and had not blinked while she said it. No one said it made a difference. No one was going to make it make a difference. The credit lines were still Conrad Vane's. The winter was still coming. The settlement still needed what it had always needed from Vane, and it needed it more than it needed to make a point on behalf of a girl it had not asked to arrive and did not know how to help. But something had shifted, slightly. The way a stone shifts when you put your weight in a different place and it doesn't move, but you feel it acknowledge the pressure. Nora went back inside the cylinder and returned to work. She had 29 days. She had $3.20 remaining after buying nails from a passing peddler and a small sack of commercial lime. The roof had not been started. The walls were half sealed. The stove was in the cylinder now, retrieved against the north interior wall, having cost her 2 days and, both hands worth of open blisters, dragged 3 miles on a travois she built from cottonwood poles and rope. The 200-pound iron box, shifting and grinding over every root tangle and creek cut in those 3 miles until she got it through the east doorway and set it against the north wall and sat on the floor beside it in the last of the afternoon light. She had built the shelter she could not afford to build. Now she had to finish it before 41 days ran out. The stove sat cold in the corner. The walls were half sealed. The roof frame existed only in her head. The firewood stacked outside was a fraction of what she would need to survive. The first freeze was coming, whether she was ready or not, and the first freeze did not care about plans or arithmetic or what any 19-year-old girl on the Kansas prairie thought she was capable of. She lay down on her blanket on the hard earth floor of the cylinder and looked up at the circle of stars visible through the open top where the roof would be, and she did not think about how far she was from finished. She thought about what she would do first in the morning. The lime work. The east wall upper section, where 3 courses of mortar had crumbled to gaps wide enough to put her thumb through. Then the clay chinking on the south side, 2 sections she had prepped yesterday, but not yet pressed. Then if there was light enough left in the afternoon, she would start laying out the center post hole for the roof. 1 step, then the next step, then the step after that. She closed her eyes. Outside, the west wind moved across the prairie the way it always had and always would, indifferent and constant, looking for things to test. The stone walls did not move. The stove retrieval had cost her 2 days and both palms. She had known going into it that the cast iron box in the abandoned dugout 3 miles east would be the hardest single task before the roof went on. She had not known because she could not have known without doing it exactly what kind of hard it would be. There is the hard of heavy labor, which is the hard of exertion and soreness and endurance. And then there is the heart of problem-solving under load, which is the heart of a thing that keeps changing on you while you are already at the limit of what your body can do. The stove retrieval was the second kind. She had built a travois from 2 cottonwood poles lashed parallel with rope at 18-inch intervals, the same design used by the Plains tribes for centuries, simple and sound. She had walked the 3 miles to the dugout in the early morning to work the stove out of the collapsed entry with a combination of leverage and patience, wrestled the 200-pound iron box onto the pole frame, and started back. The ground between the dugout and the silo was not flat. It was crossed by 2 shallow creek cuts threaded with root tangles from the cottonwood stands and broke into a low ridge halfway back that turned the dead weight of the stove into something closer to 240 pounds of friction. She dragged it, she stopped and rested, and dragged it again. By the time the silo came into view through the river timber, her left shoulder had seized into a knot that pulsed with every heartbeat, and her hands, already cracked from lime work, had opened along the heel lines and were bleeding into the rope. She got the stove through the east doorway. She set it against the north interior wall. She sat down on the floor beside it in the gray afternoon light and did not move for a long time. The sky through the open top of the cylinder was the color of old tin. 27 days to the first freeze. She had the stove. She did not have the stovepipe, but she had a plan for the stovepipe that involved flattened tin sheeting salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding she had found downstream, which she would crimp and shape into sections and fit through a hole she would chisel through the upper south wall. She did not have the roof. She did not have enough firewood. The walls were half sealed and needed to be fully sealed before any of it mattered. She ate half a portion of beans from her tin pot, lay down on her blanket, and was asleep before the last light left the open circle above her. She was up again before dawn. The lime burning had to be done in batches, and each batch required half a day of sustained fire at temperatures that demanded constant attention. She had built her burn pit 30 feet from the silo, away from the structure, and away from the wood pile, a shallow depression in the riverbank, clay lined with flat limestone slabs. She stacked dry limestone chunks in alternating layers with cottonwood splits, lit the base and kept the fire burning hot for 4 hours, feeding it steadily, maintaining the sustained heat that broke calcium carbonate down into calcium oxide. When the pit cooled, what remained was quicklime white and caustic, which reacted with water to produce the slaked lime that mixed with river sand into mortar. It was not complicated chemistry. It was brutal physical chemistry, the kind that destroyed hands and produced visible results only after hours of invisible process. And she had learned the principles of it from watching a stonemason work a repair job in Republic County 2 summers before. The stonemason had not known she was watching. She had been passing on the road and had stopped and watched for an hour and asked 3 questions and then walked on. She had not known at the time that she would ever need the information. She had stored it anyway, the way she stored everything, because she had learned that knowledge weighed nothing and could be carried indefinitely, and that you never knew which piece of it would someday become the difference between a solution and a wall. The mortar she mixed at roughly 1 part lime to 6 parts river sand, working it in her tin pot in small batches, pressing it into the deteriorated joints with a sharpened stick. She worked from the bottom of the cylinder upward because the lower joints were the most critical, carrying the most load, and because working wet mortar above your head while standing on unstable footing was the kind of compounding risk she could not afford. She moved methodically, section by section, pressing the mortar deep into each joint, smoothing the surface, moving to the next. Where the gaps were too wide for mortar, where the weather had worked the stone apart to openings nearly an inch across, she packed them with clay, chinking Kansas River clay, mixed with chopped prairie grass pressed in with her thumbs, until the gap was sealed and the clay was tight. The work was slow. It showed no progress until suddenly it showed everything, and the everything came in small increments, a section of wall going from gray and porous to white and solid, Then another section, then another, the interior slowly becoming a different place. As the gaps closed, and the wind that had whistled through the joints began to merely sigh and then stopped altogether in the lower courses. By the 12th of October, 18 days from the projected first freeze, the interior walls were sealed from ground level to 7 feet. The upper 3 feet were still open, still gray, still leaking cold air through joints she had not been able to reach without scaffolding. She planned to seal those from above once the roof was in place. It was a calculated risk. The lower 7 feet of sealed wall would hold the stove heat in the breathing space where she lived and slept, and the upper joints would lose some of that heat to the outside air, but not catastrophically, not lethally. She had worked out the math as well as she could with the information she had, which was imperfect math done with imperfect information, but it was the math she had, and it was better than no math at all. Then it rained. The storm came out of the northwest on the night of the 11th of October, announced by no particular warning, just the sky going from clear to overcast between sundown and midnight, and then the rain beginning slow at first, and then sustain the kind of steady rain that the Kansas plains could produce in the fall, with no drama and no lightning and no wind, just a gray ceiling pressing down and releasing water at a rate that the packed earth of the river bottom could not absorb quickly enough. She woke when the first drop hit her face. For a moment she lay still and listened to the sound of water on limestone, a soft, inconsistent percussion that meant rain was finding the open top of the cylinder and falling through. Then she felt the floor under her blanket and felt it was wet, and she sat up. 2 inches of standing water on the packed earth floor rising. The open top of the silo was a perfect rain collector, a 14-foot circle with no drainage except the slow seep of water through the floor, and the floor was not seeping fast enough. She got to her feet. She picked up her tin pot. She bailed the floor with the tin pot for 3 hours in the dark, dipping and carrying and dumping. Outside the east doorway, dipping and carrying and dumping the water rising, and then stabilizing, and then slowly dropping as her bailing outpaced the rainfall. The rain slowed around 3 in the morning and stopped before first light. She bailed until the floor was mud rather than standing water, then sat on her sleeping platform which she had pulled up against the east wall above the floodline and looked at what the rain had done. The mortar she had applied the previous day was gone. Not damaged, gone. Fresh lime mortar required 3 to 5 days to cure to initial strength, and before it reached that strength, it was vulnerable to water, and the rain had found the fresh applied sections and done exactly what water does to uncured lime mortar, which was to dissolve it and carry it away with the draining water. Sections she had spent the better part of 2 days sealing were open again, gray and crumbled as if she had never touched them. She looked at the walls in the gray pre-dawn light. She picked up her stick. She mixed a new batch of mortar in the tin pot. She started over. She lost 3 days. Not 3 days of rest, not 3 days of wasted time, but 3 days of actual forward progress simply erased, requiring re-execution from the beginning. The mortar had to be reapplied. The clay chinking had to be repressed into the wider gaps. The surface finish had to be resmoothed. 3 days of work done twice, which meant 3 days lost from the 41 she had started with, and which were now down to 15. 15 days. No roof. Firewood reserve, a cord and a half of cottonwood stacked outside the south wall. She needed 4 to 6 cords minimum. 1.5 cords was not the minimum. 1.5 cords was a death sentence delivered slowly. She did not allow herself to calculate the total shortfall. She had learned that the total shortfall was a number that could stop you from moving if you looked at it directly. Instead, she sat on the floor at 2 in the morning with the empty tin pot in her hands in the dark, in the cylinder that still had no roof and not enough wood in walls that were only partially sealed for the second time, and she counted the hours until first light. Not the days, the hours. How many hours until there was enough light to work? How many batches of mortar she could mix and apply between sunrise and the light failing? How many sections of wall she could seal in a single day if she did not stop for anything that was not strictly necessary? This was the thing she had found over years of hard circumstances that most people had not. The total distance between where you stood and where you needed to be was a number that could break you. The next step was not. The next step was just a step. You took the step, and then you looked at the next one, and you took that one too, And you did not look up to see how far you still had to go, because looking up cost you the step you were in the middle of taking. She looked at the hours until first light. There were 4. She lay down and slept for 3 of them. The roof was the problem that could kill him. Not the cold directly, not the wind, not the inadequate firewood. The roof was the single variable she could not compensate for with cleverness or substitution or endurance. Without a roof, the silo was an effective windbreak and nothing more. Without a roof, every fire she built would heat the open sky above her. Without a roof, the rain would keep coming in, and the mortar would keep washing out, and the temperature differential between inside and outside on the coldest nights would be essentially zero. The roof was not optional, and the roof was the thing she had never done. She felled 7 cottonwood poles over 4 days, selecting from the river timber. With the carpenter's eye she had been developing by necessity, looking for the straightest, the thickest, the ones with the most consistent diameter from base to crown. She was looking for something else too: dryness. Green cottonwood was soft wood that absorbed moisture and swelled under load and split along its grain when the load became uneven. She needed the driest wood the river bottom had to offer, which was not very dry, but was what she had. She dragged each pole back to the silo individually. The longest of them was nearly 12 feet, cut from a section of drift timber she found wedged in a log jam a quarter-mile downstream. It was heavier than the others, and the dragging took most of a morning, but it was straighter than anything else she had found, and she needed it for the longest span. The plan she had worked out in her head over many nights was this: erect a center post 10 feet tall by seating its base in a hole at the exact center of the silo floor and bracing its top with a cross beam wedged between opposing wall tops. Lay 7 radial rafters from the wall tops to the center post, lashing them at both ends with rope and driving nails where the metal would hold. Lay cross poles perpendicular to the rafters for lateral support. Bundle prairie grass into thick sheaves and layer them over the frame in overlapping courses. Cut sod strips 12 inches by 24 inches, 4 inches thick, and lay them over the grass in overlapping courses the way a man lays shingles, each strip overlapping the one below by half its length so that any gap in one strip was covered by the strip above it. She had done this in her mind so many times that the steps felt familiar. Her hands had done none of them. She borrowed Everett Goss's post hole digger on the morning of the 18th of October, having come to his homestead the previous afternoon to ask, which cost her something, because asking costs something every time. Goss had handed it over without commentary and without the expression that some men wore when they were doing you a favor and wanted you to know the weight of it. He handed it over the way you handed someone a tool they needed. She thanked him and walked back south. The center post went up that morning. She seated its base 18 inches into the floor at the exact center of the cylinder, packing the hole with tamped clay for stability, then raised the pole upright with her shoulder under the crown, holding it vertical with one hand, while she positioned the crossbeam with the other, which was the kind of operation that required 3 hands, and she had 2, which meant it required 3 attempts and a length of rope tied from the pole's midpoint to the east wall as a temporary brace while she adjusted the crossbeam's position. The crossbeam was a 6-foot cottonwood section, and she wedged it between the north and south wall tops at a height that met the pole at its crown, lashing the joint with 3 wraps of rope and driving 2 nails through the lashing. Then she began the rafters. The first rafter she positioned from the south wall top to the center post, lashing it at both ends, testing the joint with her weight before committing to the next one. It held. She positioned the second rafter, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Each one took its place in the radial pattern, like the spokes of a wheel, the wall tops forming the rim and the center post forming the hub. The frame was taking shape, and she could see it now, not as an abstraction in her mind, but as a real structure, real wood and real rope and real geometry, and she allowed herself a measured moment of satisfaction before she went back to work. She had begun loading the first sod strips onto the completed sections, working from the outside edge inward, when she picked up the 7th rafter. It was the longest of the 7, the 12-foot section from the drift timber log jam, and it was the last to be placed. She maneuvered it into position with the careful deliberateness she had applied to every step of this process, raising the wall top end and walking it up hand over hand until it was elevated enough to lay against the center post, then easing the crown end into place in the lashing. She was tightening the rope at the center post end, when she heard it. A sound like a green branch snapping under boot weight, sharp and clean and final. She felt it through the rope before she heard it fully, a slight shudder in the tension, a vibration that didn't belong. She looked at the rafter. A split. Running 6 inches up from the midpoint of the pole following a grain line she had not been able to see from the outside. The wood had been checked internally, a hidden seam of weakness running through the heart of the timber that the surface showed no sign of. The pole was bowed slightly downward at the center, maybe a quarter inch, maybe less. It had not broken. But the crack was real, and it was in the worst possible location, the midpoint of the longest span where the load would be greatest. The sod strips she had already laid on the completed sections were resting on the frame. She looked at them, and she looked at the split rafter, and she did the calculation in approximately 2 seconds. She pulled the sod strips off in one motion, working fast, hauling them back from the completed sections before their weight could transfer to the compromised rafter through the cross poles. She worked without panic, which was the only way she knew how to work, because panic spent energy you needed for the task and produced no useful output. The strips came off. The weight came off the frame. The rafter sagged but held the split, not propagating the pole, staying in one piece under its own weight without the additional load. She looked at it for a long moment in the gray October afternoon light. Then she unlashed it. She lifted it down and carried it outside. She stood outside the silo with the rejected rafter on the ground at her feet, and she looked at the river timber, and she thought, this was the step that ended plans. Not the dramatic failure, not the wall collapsing, or the flood, or the confrontation with Vane. The quiet failure, the hidden grain line, the thing you could not have seen until it showed itself, and it showed itself at the worst possible moment, with the sod on the frame and the calendar at 15 days and the sky to the northwest going the color that meant there might be more rain before the week was out. She picked up her axe and walked down to the river. She worked the timber for 2 hours in the fading afternoon light, moving along the bank testing poles by striking them and listening to the sound by pressing on the midpoint and feeling for flex by looking at the grain pattern in the end cut. She was looking for something specific, and she knew she might not find it, and she kept looking anyway. Green poles were everywhere. Dry poles were rare. Dead wood that had been standing or caught in drift for long enough to season properly was the prize she was after, and the river did not always offer prizes. She found it wedged in a debris tangle 150 yards downstream. It was gray-barked and light in her hands in a way that green cottonwood was not the specific lightness of wood that had given up most of its moisture to time. Dead wood, a cottonwood pole that had come down in some previous season and been caught in the river debris and had been drying there for at least 1 full year, possibly 2. It was not as straight as the pole she was replacing. It had a slight bow to it, a curve of perhaps 2 inches over its full length, which would mean the northeast quadrant of the roof would sit marginally lower than the rest. It was not as thick at the crown end, tapering more sharply than ideal, but it was dry, and dry meant hard relative to green, and hard meant it would carry the load without the hidden failures that greenwood carried inside itself, like promises it could not keep. She dragged it back. She lost the last of the afternoon light doing it. She worked by feel in the early dark, lashing the replacement rafter into place by touch, and rope memory, tightening each wrap until she felt the tension she was looking for, driving the nails by sound in the darkness. She finished loading the sod strips by feel, the last 4 sections placed in the dark by memory of where she had been and where the frame told her to go. On the morning of October 25th, she climbed on top of the silo from the south side using the stone courses as a ladder and looked at the finished roof. It sat slightly uneven. The northeast quadrant was lower by 1 inch, maybe 2, where the replacement rafter's bow expressed itself under the weight of the suit. The surface was not the smooth geometry she had imagined, but the rough organic geometry of what was actually possible. Irregular sod seams, slightly misaligned grass bundles, showing through at 2 gaps, the north center section sitting a little higher than it should, where the cross poles had settled unevenly. She pressed down at the center with both hands and felt nothing give. She pressed at the northeast quadrant over the replacement rafter, the one she had found in the dark, and lashed in by feel and felt the same thing. Nothing. No deflection, no creak, no warning vibration. She came back down and went inside and put her hand on the center post and looked up at the sod roof above her, at the closed circle where the open sky had been for every night she had slept in this cylinder since the beginning of October. The light that came through now was dim and diffuse, filtered through sod and grass and pole, in a way that made the interior feel for the first time like a room rather than an outdoor space with an unusually solid fence around it. She had two problems remaining before the first freeze. Two leaking seams between sod strips in the northeast quadrant, visible as thin lines of gray light when she stood below and looked up. And the upper 3 feet of wall, still unsealed, still breathing cold through the open joints. She would fix the seams first. The wall she would address after sealing from inside using the post tops as a working ledge. She put the problem of the firewood aside in the part of her mind where she kept the problems that had no solution available today. 1.5 cords of cottonwood stacked outside the south wall. She needed 4 to 6 cords. The mathematics of that shortfall were exactly as bad as they had been for weeks, and thinking about them did not make them better, so she thought instead about the next step, which was to seal the leaking seams. And then on the morning of October 28th, she found the bag on the sleeping platform. She had gone to the river at first light for sand mixing material for a small sealing batch to fill the sod gaps. She was gone perhaps an hour. When she came back and stepped through the east doorway, she saw the bag immediately sitting on the sleeping platform against the east wall, where nothing had been sitting when she left. It was a cloth bag, the kind used for seed or coffee, folded over once at the top. She looked at it for a moment before she touched it, taking in the situation, the bag that had not been there an hour ago, the soft ground outside the doorway that would show the marks of whoever had left it. She looked at the ground. Boot prints. A man's boots by the size and depth coming from the north and returning to the north. Fresh, within the hour. She opened the bag. 14 iron nails, cut nails of the common-size good ones. Not the bent or corroded kind you found in salvage, but new nails, or near new, stored clean and dry. And beneath them a ball of baling wire, the heavy gauge kind, coiled tight. She held one of the nails in her palm and looked at it. She knew from the direction of the boot prints and from the seams and from the hour, which was early enough, that most of the settlement's men were not yet away from their own work who had left it. There was only one man in Reed's Crossing who had the carpenter's knowledge to understand exactly what a woman building a sod roof from cottonwood poles needed in order to secure the seams against wind lift and water infiltration. Only one man who had stood in this doorway and assessed the structural situation with a professional eye and said nothing while he was forming a conclusion. Everett Goss had told her he thought she would die in the silo. He had said it not unkindly, and he had not changed his mind since. She understood that. He was not helping her because he believed she would succeed. He was helping her because he could not tell her where else she was supposed to go, and that absence of an answer was its own kind of answer, and a man with a carpenter's conscience did not walk away from that without leaving something behind. For the seams, the nails said as clearly as if he had spoken the words. He did not stay to hear her response. He did not tell anyone in the settlement that he had come. He put on his hat and rode back north and went back to his own work. She drove the nails into the wooden cross poles at the two leaking seams, running the baling wire in a figure-8 pattern between the nail heads in the sod strips above, pulling the sod tight against the grass bundle below it until the gap closed. The wire went around the base of the center post as a backup, lashing a second line of security against the joint, shifting under the first hard wind. She had used both the nails and the wire before she came inside and stood in the dim interior light and looked up at the roof that no longer showed any lines of gray sky. She pressed her hand against the sealed surface at both seam locations. Nothing moved. The first hard freeze arrived on the 9th of November, 4 days after she declared the silo finished by her own accounting, which was the accounting that mattered to no one but herself and the walls. She had borrowed Everett Goss's thermometer the previous evening, asking for it plainly at his door, without explanation, and he had handed it over without asking for one. She checked it at dawn. Outside 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside 44 degrees 8 hours after she had last fed the stove. She stood in the middle of the cylinder with the thermometer in her hand and looked at the number. 44 degrees was not warm. 44 degrees was not comfortable. 44 degrees was what the space inside a structure maintained by 20 inches of solid limestone wall after 8 hours with no active heat source and 12-degree external air. and it was 32 degrees above the point where a person began dying of exposure, which was the only threshold that mattered. She had calculated this. The thermal time lag of stone walls this thick was documented in the engineering principles she had pieced together from 3 different sources over the previous months: a surveyor's pamphlet she had read in Republic County, a conversation with the stonemason, and her own observation of the way the silo walls behaved on cold nights after she had lit small fires inside for mortar drying. Stone absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. An 18 to 20-inch limestone wall took 8 to 12 hours to transfer a temperature change from one side to the other, which meant that when the sun heated the exterior surface during the day, the interior would not feel that warmth until evening. And when the night cold drove the exterior temperature down to 12 degrees, the interior would not feel the full effect of that cold until the following midday, by which time the day's sun would already be warming the exterior again. The stone was a buffer, a thermal flywheel spinning between the extremes of day and night, absorbing the peaks and releasing the valleys, holding the interior in a narrower range of temperature than the outside world. She returned the thermometer to Goss that morning and borrowed it again in the evening, developing an informal arrangement that neither of them discussed explicitly. The day shortened, the temperature dropped and stayed down. By the first week of December, the Big Blue River had frozen at its edges, and the cottonwood stands along the bank stood bare and gray against the white sky. The coldest nights drove the thermometer to 5 degrees. The interior of the silo at those temperatures held by dawn between 40 and 44 degrees. Livable. Not comfortable, but livable, which was the only distinction that the Kansas winter was willing to make. But the firewood was going. She had been burning carefully from the beginning, banking the stove at night to a low sustained feed, waking at 2 in the morning to add wood and bring the interior back to a temperature that let her sleep rather than shiver, then banking it again and sleeping until dawn. This was the minimum burn rate she could maintain while keeping the interior above the critical threshold, and even at this minimum rate, the woodpile outside the south wall was visibly, measurably diminishing. She calculated one night in early December, with the thermometer showing 7 degrees outside and the stove ticking quietly with a banked load, that at her current burn rate, she would exhaust the cottonwood supply by the middle of January. February was statistically the coldest month in Marshall County. The hard cold of January and February, the nights that dropped to -10 or worse, were the nights that demanded the most fuel, and those were exactly the nights she would meet with an empty woodpile. She had known this was coming. The arithmetic had never worked out. She had built the silo in the time she had and cut the wood she could in the time that remained after the building, and the remaining time had not been enough for the wood. This was the one place where the 41 days had beaten her. Not the walls, not the roof, not the stove installation, but the firewood. There simply had not been time to do all of it, and she had correctly prioritized the structure over the fuel, because a person with enough fuel and no shelter was dead just as surely as a person with no fuel, and at the time the choice had been the only rational one available. That did not make the January problem go away. It made it a rational problem instead of an irrational one, which was something but was not a solution. She found the solution on the prairie. Twisted hay was not a new technology. It was so old and so common on the treeless plains of Kansas and Nebraska that most settlers knew it without having been taught it the way you know things that everyone around you has always known. You took dry prairie grass, a large handful, and you twisted it on itself, rolling it tight under tension until it held its coiled shape without untwisting. The result burned like a slow log. Not like a fast log, not with the sustained heat output of seasoned hardwood, but for 15 to 20 minutes throwing enough heat to make a real contribution to a small stove, especially a stove in a space with the thermal properties of the limestone cylinder. The prairie around the silo had more dry grass than she could burn in a year. The grass was free. The grass required no hauling from the river, no axe work, no drying time. It required only her hands and the time after dark when there was no other work she could do. She began cutting and twisting bundles by firelight in the evenings, stacking them against the interior east wall where they stayed dry. She developed a rhythm, 6 bundles in the time it took the stove to work through a single piece of cottonwood. She stacked the bundles by the dozen. She rationed the cottonwood to the coldest nights, the nights when the exterior thermometer dropped below 0, and the hay bundles alone could not maintain the interior above the threshold she needed. And she burned the hay the rest of the time, feeding the stove every 20 minutes through the long nights, waking and sleeping in short intervals. The pattern of her rest determined not by her own fatigue, but by the burn rate of twisted grass. The stovepipe accumulated creosote faster with the hay fuel. She cleaned it every 3 days with a rag tied to the end of a cottonwood switch, running it up through the collar and scraping the interior walls of the improvised tin sections. This was not pleasant work, and it was not optional. A creosote fire in a stovepipe made from crimped tin sheeting would end the winter before January did. She lost 5 pounds in December. She had already lost 15 in the fall from the work and the rationed eating and the cold that a body burns through calories fighting even when the fighting is partially won. She was lean in a way that had ceased to feel like deprivation and had simply become the shape of what she was now. She did not think about it in those terms. She thought about the wood and the hay and the temperature differential and the creosote and the next batch of mortar she still needed to mix for the upper wall sections she could not reach until spring. And she thought about these things the way she always thought about hard problems, one step at a time, the next step only. Solomon Hatch thought about her in different terms. Every evening through November and into December, Hatch went to his own doorstep after supper and looked south. He did not announce this habit. His daughter Ruth knew about it because she had seen him do it, and she understood with the perceptiveness of an 11-year-old who had grown up watching her father make difficult calculations that it was not casual. It was the specific attention of a man checking the result of a prediction he had made with confidence. The smoke rose from the silo's stovepipe every evening, thin and pale in the cold air, bending slightly east in the west wind, visible from 3/4 of a mile in the flat winter landscape. Steady, not the heavy smoke of a man burning extravagant amounts of wood for comfort, but the thin, consistent thread of a fire being managed at its minimum, a fire being sustained with precision rather than abundance. He had told her she would be dead by Christmas. It was the second week of December. The smoke was still rising. He went inside and closed his door. He did not say anything about it to anyone. He was a man who had made a judgment and staked the weight of his experience on that judgment, and the judgment was so far wrong, and he was not ready to articulate what that meant. He needed more data. He needed the hard months. January, February, the -10 nights. He had seen this prairie kill men with more resources than that girl had. He had buried one of them. He would wait and see what February said. Everett Goss came by the silo on an evening in the second week of December, arriving without warning, which was not unusual for him. He dismounted, tied his horse to a cottonwood sapling outside the east doorway, and came inside. He looked at the stacked hay bundles reaching to the ceiling on the east wall. He looked at the stove installation. The crimped tin stovepipe fitting through the chiseled hole in the upper south wall, sealed around the collar with a clay packing that had cured to the color of old brick. He looked at the whitewashed interior walls, the coat of slaked lime she had applied to the interior surfaces in late October, brightening the gray stone to a pale white that reflected the stove's light and made the space feel marginally larger and less like a place where something had gone wrong. He sat on the sleeping platform. She handed him a tin cup of coffee. He held it in both hands and looked at the walls. "It's warmer in here than my place," he said. It was not quite a question. 44 degrees at 2 in the morning, she said. He looked at her. "My place runs 31. I've been getting up 3 times a night." She said nothing. He looked at the walls again, the 20-inch stone, the whitewashed surface, the pale mass of it. He had built a frame cabin with corner joints and wall studs and nails, the standard construction of every new settler in Marshall County, the construction that every land handbill and every neighbor and every piece of common wisdom said was the right way to build a house on the frontier. And he was getting up 3 times a night in 31-degree air. He asked how it worked. He asked the question directly without the deflection men sometimes used when they wanted to know something but didn't want to admit the wanting. He asked as if he had earned the right to a straight answer by being the only person in Reed's Crossing who had handed her a tool and not expected her to fail visibly before the winner proved him right. She explained the thermal mass. She explained the geometry: a circle enclosed more area per foot of wall than any rectangle of similar dimensions, which meant fewer square feet of wall surface per unit of enclosed space, which meant less surface area through which the heat could escape to the outside. She explained the mortar joints and the reason she had sealed them, not just against wind infiltration, but against conducted cold, because stone conducted cold as readily as it conducted heat, and every open joint was a thermal bridge connecting the interior warmth to the exterior cold, shorting out the buffer the mass was trying to provide. Goss listened to all of it. He did not write anything down. He had the kind of mind that stored what it heard in structural form, organizing information the way he organized lumber by load path and connection point. He finished the coffee. He stood up and put on his hat. Cravensworth was asking about you, he said at the door. The name he used was Solomon Hatches. The name the settlement used informally, the settler's habit of matching the man to his land. He was asking whether you were still alive. What did you tell him, she said. I told him you were Goss said. He seemed a little surprised. He went out into the cold, and she heard his horse moving north through the cottonwoods, and she stood in the doorway for a moment feeling the cold on her face before she went back inside to twist hay. The months moved the way months move, in extreme cold, which is to say not gradually, but in a series of individual confrontations, each one requiring something specific, each one ending and being replaced immediately by the next without rest or transition. A -12 night in January that burned through her rationed cottonwood supply faster than she had planned. A thaw in the first week of February that turned the floor to mud and required 2 days of drainage management before she could use the stove without smoking herself out. A February week of consecutive below-zero nights that tested the thermal mass of the limestone against the hardest cold the prairie had delivered all winter. The stone held. The temperature differential between inside and outside narrowed on the coldest nights, reaching its worst on a February morning when the exterior thermometer read -15 and the interior at dawn showed 37 degrees, 8 degrees above freezing, maintained by a stove burning a combination of twisted hay and her last cord of cottonwood. 37 degrees was not warm. 37 degrees was not comfortable. 37 degrees was 12 degrees above the threshold she could not go below, and the stone had given her those 12 degrees in the depths of the worst cold the 1878 to 1879 Kansas winter had in it. She carried deadfall home from the river bottom on her back, through knee-deep snow and temperatures that turned the moisture in her breath to ice crystals on her scarf before it dispersed. Her left boot split at the sole in a February river bottom trip, the leather failing at a seam she had not seen coming, and she bound it with strips of rabbit hide from a trap she had set along the south bank and checked every other morning. The hide held for 2 weeks before the wet snow broke the stitching. She did not buy new boots. She did not have the money for new boots. She wrapped the sole with a doubled strip of cottonwood bark and kept walking. By March, the cottonwood reserve was gone. She had stretched it as far as she could, rationing it to the coldest nights, and burning twisted hay, for the rest sleeping in short intervals between hay feedings, waking in the dark to the sound of the stove going cold. What remained was the prairie grass itself, which was not going to run out, and the diminishing cold which was receding in the way that Kansas cold receded not gradually but in stages. A cold day followed by a slightly less cold day, followed by a cold day again, but with a trend that the thermometer confirmed even when the skin could not. She was alive. She was 20 pounds lighter than she had been in September. Her hands had a quality they would keep for the rest of her life, the specific roughness of hands that had done continuous work in cold and lime and clay for 6 months without adequate protection. Her left boot was held together with bark and habit. She had $3 and some coins remaining of the $7.40 she had counted on the steps of Vane's store in September. She was alive. It was March. Solomon Hatch had said she would be dead by Christmas. Outside on the mornings when the temperature had come up enough to make the effort worthwhile, she could hear the river beginning to change. A shift in the sound of it from the locked silence of deep winter to something with more movement in it, the ice at the edges thinning and giving way, the current reasserting itself against the freeze. The cottonwood stands along the bank were still bare, but if she looked closely at the tips of the upper branches, she could see something beginning there. The slight swelling that preceded the green, the tree making its annual argument that what had been frozen was not finished. She looked at those branch tips in the cold March mornings and thought about the next winter. Because there would be a next winter, and it would require 6 cords of wood at minimum, and this time she was going to start cutting in May. She was already making the plan. April came in cold and then warmer, the way Kansas springs always came, not as a gift, but as a negotiation, offering 2 warm days and taking one back. letting the temperature climb into the 50s and then dropping it to the 20s overnight, testing the landscape the way the landscape had spent the winter testing her. The river thawed from the center outward. She watched it happen over the course of a week, the dark open water appearing first in the fastest part of the current, then widening toward the banks as the ice thinned and broke and moved downstream in pale, irregular sheets that caught the morning light. The cottonwood stands put out green buds the size of thumbnails. The prairie grass, the same grass she had twisted into bundles through the long winter nights, began pushing new growth up through the dead stalks, thin and vivid green against the gray of the old. She cut the last of the twisted hay bundles from her interior stack in the first week of April and burned them in a morning fire, and felt for the first time since September the specific sensation of not calculating. The cold was not gone. It would come back on some nights through May. But the arithmetic of survival had shifted from the desperate calculus of the deep winter, every cord of wood against every degree of cold, every bundle of hay against every hour of darkness, to something more ordinary. The prairie was repaying its debt. The phrase she had heard an old farmer use once in Missouri, and she had not understood it then, the way she understood it now in her body, in the loosening of something that had been held tight for 6 months. She pulled the sleeping platform away from the east wall and moved it to the south side closer to the doorway, where the morning light came in longer. She mixed a final batch of mortar and sealed the last of the upper wall joints she had not been able to reach through the winter, working from the pole tops as a ledge, pressing the lime mixture into the gaps she had looked at every day since October and not been able to touch. The cylinder was fully sealed now, top to bottom, inside and out. The wind that found the exterior walls and split and rejoined behind the structure found no path through them. She stood inside and listened. The silence inside the silo was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of exclusion. The wind that moved across the prairie in April was not gentle. It was the same wind that had moved across it in November and December, westerly and persistent and cold at its edges. But inside the limestone cylinder, that whined was a sound rather than a presence, a low note heard through 20 inches of stone rather than felt on the skin. She had lived inside that distinction for 6 months, and it had saved her life, and she understood it now, not as an abstraction, but as a physical truth she carried in her body. She began cutting cottonwood in May, not May as a target, not May as an aspiration, but May as a decision made in February, when the firewood ran out and the arithmetic of the previous autumn was fully resolved. She had started cutting in September, and it had nearly killed her. She would start in May, and she would not be caught short again. The river bottom had wood enough. It always had wood enough. The issue was time, and time was the one resource she could manage if she started before the urgency was on her. She fell cottonwood poles in the mornings and dragged them to the silo and stacked them against the south wall in the afternoons, working a section of riverbank she had identified over the winter as the most productive, where the timber grew thickest and the deadfall was most accessible. She was building a wood pile, not the desperate, inadequate pile of last September, but a real reserve, planned and systematic, growing by chord increments through the long spring days. She also began cutting a kitchen garden into the bank clay south of the silo, turning the soil with a stick, and her hands in a flat stone she shaped into a rough spade over 2 evenings. She planted beans from her seed stock, the last of the supplies she had bought at Vane's store in September, keeping enough back for the following season. The garden was small. It would not feed her through a winter, but it would supplement what she could buy or trade for, and every bean she grew herself was a bean she did not have to pay Conrad Vane's prices for, and the arithmetic of that, accumulated over months and years, was the arithmetic of independence. She was thinking in years now, not days, not hours, years. The April storms came before she had fully processed the fact that the winter was behind her. She put her hand flat against the south interior wall and felt what she always felt, which was the stone absorbing the force and distributing it, and holding, not flexing, not transmitting the directional push of the wind as a shove, but as a vibration spread evenly through the mass. The silo did not move. 40 yards north, Everett Goss's frame cabin was having a different experience. She could hear it from inside the silo, the specific sounds of a wooden structure under high lateral load, the groan of the wall studs flexing between their connections, the creak of the plate joints straining against the nails that held them. The sounds were not catastrophic. The cabin did not fail. But when the front had passed and she came outside to assess the landscape, Goss was outside too, working the south and west walls of his cabin with a board and a handful of fresh mud, chinking, pressing it into the cracks that had opened at the corner joints while the wind was on them. She walked over. The damage was specific, and she recognized it immediately. The corners. The east and west walls of the cabin met the north and south walls at 90-degree angles, and those angles were where the chinking had cracked the mud and straw packing blown out in fragments by the pressure that had concentrated at those points while the walls flexed. She told him why. She told him the way she told him things when she was certain of them, which was directly and without the softening she had seen other people apply to information that might be taken as criticism. A frame wall was flat. A flat wall acted like a sail under lateral wind load, catching the full dynamic pressure of the moving air across its entire surface. At the corners where two flat walls met, the pressure from both walls converged at a single point, and the geometry of that convergence doubled the effective load at the joint. The nails and the mortise connections at those corners were the weakest elements in the structure, designed to hold the assembly together under the dead load of the roof and the walls themselves. They were not designed to carry the doubled wind load that the corner geometry created in a high wind event. Goss listened. He did not argue with the physics. He pressed another handful of chinking into a corner gap and looked at the wall. "You're telling me my cabin is built wrong," he said. "I'm telling you why the corners cracked," she said. "That's not the same thing." He looked at her sideways. "What's the difference?" "The difference is that the design is standard and reasonable for most conditions," she said. "It's only wrong relative to this specific thing, and knowing what it's wrong for tells you what to do about it." He looked at the corner. She could see him working through it, the structural logic of what she had described, fitting it to what he had felt in the cabin during the wind, the flex he had noticed in the west wall, the creak at the corner plates. He said nothing more that afternoon. He kept chinking. She walked back south. Solomon Hatch heard about the corner cracks from someone in the settlement. She was not sure who, but he heard it within a day as things moved through Reed's Crossing. She knew he heard it because she saw him from a distance, 3 days after the April storm, driving his wagon slowly along the dirt track south of the settlement, and he stopped the wagon on the section of track closest to the silo and sat on the seat and looked at the exterior walls for a long time without dismounting. She was inside when she heard the wagon. She came out through the east doorway and stood in the clearing. He did not look at her immediately. He was looking at the walls, the east face visible from the track, studying the mortar joints, the way a man studies a thing he has been thinking about and is now checking against the version in his head. "The wall is still plumb," he said. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to himself, or to some internal accounting he was running, checking the current result against the expected one. The words were the words of a man whose prediction had not arrived at the expected answer, and who was now in the process of revising his understanding. "It hasn't moved since 1870, she said. "Before I got here." He looked down from the wagon seat at her. Something in his expression had shifted from the man who had stood in his barn doorway in September and told her there was nothing for a girl with no kin. Not warmth, not apology, but a relinquishment of the certainty that had been on his face that evening. The certainty of a man who knew what the prairie could do and knew what a 19-year-old girl with $7 could not do in response to it. That certainty had been accurate in his experience. It had been wrong in this instance. He was too honest a man to pretend otherwise and too careful a man to speak the adjustment prematurely. "Wait until the real wind hits," he said. He looked at the prairie, the flat sweep of it to the south and west. "I've seen what this land does in the spring. Wind that picks up a loaded wagon and moves it 20 feet. You want to know how your stone tube handles that? You wait until May." He clicked his tongue at the horses and drove on. She watched the wagon move north along the track until it was small in the distance. She went back inside and looked at her firewood pile, which was taller by 3 cords than it had ever been at this time in any previous year. She looked at the sealed walls and the sod roof and the cold stove in the repaired northeast quadrant, where she had replaced the 2 damaged rafter sections after the winter using dry wood. This time wood she had seasoned herself under the south overhang of the silo through the late winter months. She picked up her axe and went back to the river. The morning of the 30th of May, 1879 arrived, the way dangerous days on the Kansas prairie It always arrived quietly and then all at once. The temperature at sunrise was 68 degrees. For the last day of May in Marshall County, 68 degrees at sunrise was not unusual, but it was the quality of the heat that morning that was different. Not the dry heat of the Kansas summer, but something heavier, laden with moisture, pushed north from the Gulf of Mexico by a sustained southerly wind that had been building for 2 days. The air sat on the settlement like wet wool. It pressed down on the grass and the river timber and the skin, and it made the work of the morning slow and imprecise, the kind of heat that made hands clumsy and attention wander. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 91 degrees. She had been cutting cottonwood poles along the river since early morning, working the timber section 200 yards south of the silo building, the fourth court of her winter reserve. She stopped at noon because the heat was doing what she knew heat did to fine work, which was make it coarser than it needed to be, and she did not want coarser work on the wood she was laying in for next winter. She drank from the river and went inside the silo to rest for an hour in the cool that the stone wall still held from the previous night. The thermal mass worked in both directions. In winter, it held heat in summer, it held cool in. The interior of the silo at noon on a 91-degree day was 63 degrees, a difference of 28 degrees maintained by the same 20 inches of stone that had held 44 degrees against 12-degree air in February. She lay on her sleeping platform in the cool and felt the temperature on her skin and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in she could not remember how long. She came back outside at 1 o'clock. She looked northwest. The sky in that direction was the wrong color. She had not seen the color before. She had heard about it. Every old settler on the plains talked about it, eventually the yellow-green of a certain kind of sky before a certain kind of storm, a color that existed in no other context, a color the plains invented specifically for these moments so that the living things on them would know. Horses knew it without being told. Cattle knew it. She looked at the color and felt something she did not have a name for that lived below the level of thought in the part of the body that had been handling danger assessments longer than language had existed. She put her axe down on the ground and stood still and looked at the sky. Solomon Hatch's horses were in their paddock 3/4 of a mile north. She could not see them clearly at that distance, but she could see that they were not grazing. They were in the far corner of the paddock, and they were still. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the clouds to the northwest came up suddenly, not gradually, not as a slow darkening of the horizon, but as a wall, a dark rolling mass that moved forward at a visible rate, and behind it from the southwest, a second mass of cloud moving in a different direction, entirely the two systems crossing at an angle that created a temporary clear window. Directly overhead, a piece of blue sky that looked almost normal and was the most abnormal thing she had ever seen in any sky anywhere. She had left her axe on the ground. She did not pick it up. She stood in the clearing south of the silo and watched the two cloud masses converge and the blue window close, and then she heard the sound begin. It was not thunder. She had heard thunder all her life, and this was not it. Thunder peaked and rolled and faded. This was continuous. A deep rolling roar that did not peak and did not fade but held and grew, building on itself the way a wave builds before it breaks lower than thunder, in its register felt in the chest, in the gut, rather than heard primarily in the ears. She had no reference point for the sound and could not place it against any experience she had. Later, she would struggle to describe it and fail. Later, she would simply say it was the sound of something very large moving very fast and leave it at that. She ran for the silo. She was through the east doorway and pulling the sleeping platform across the opening when she heard the first funnel touch down to the southwest. She did not see it. She did not need to see it. The sound told her everything the sight would have. It changed in character when the funnel grounded, adding a lower grinding note beneath the roar, the sound of a column of rotating air in contact with the earth, picking up the earth, turning the earth into something else entirely. She braced the sleeping platform against the doorframe, with its legs angled into the packed earth floor, creating a wedge that the door could not push past from the outside. She put her back against the east wall and her feet against the platform and looked at the ceiling and waited. The wind found the silo. She felt it arrive before she heard it change a pressure shift in the interior air, a slight equalization as the exterior pressure differential increased. Then the sound on the outside wall became something beyond what the April storms had been, beyond any reference she had for wind noise. a sustained roar that was also a pressure, a thing that pressed against the curved limestone surface and could not find a flat plane to push against and split around the curve and rejoined behind the structure and kept going. She put her hand flat against the south interior wall. The stone trembled, not moved, trembled. The way a struck bell transmits the force of impact through its mass, not as displacement, but as vibration. A shudder moving through the stone in all directions, simultaneously dispersing into the geometry of the ring, finding every stone in the circle and sharing the load with every other stone. The force arriving at the exterior wall was not pushing a flat surface. It was meeting a curve, and the curve was redirecting it, splitting it left and right, sending it around the circumference where it was absorbed by the hoop compression of the ring itself, the same principle that made a barrel stronger than a box. The circular form under lateral load transferring force into compression along its own circumference rather than bending stress at its corners. The wall did not move. She kept her hand there. The vibration moved through her palm and her wrist and her forearm, the language of 40 tons of limestone communicating with the force applied to it and answering with refusal the specific answer of mass and geometry, and the labor of whoever had stacked those stones in 1870, and the labor she had put into them since October. All of it speaking at once in a frequency she felt in her bones. The wall did not move. Then the door shook. Not the wind, something different. A specific impact, an intentional pressure, and then a voice, a woman's voice, high and urgent, calling her name over the roaring. She had not known Clara Swenson knew her name. She had spoken to the school teacher twice in the 8 months she had been at Reed's Crossing, both times briefly, both times with the caution that everyone in the settlement maintained when Vane's credit lines might be listening. She pulled the platform aside and Clara Swenson came through the doorway with her son wrapped in both arms, the boy's quilt pulled around him against the cold, and the wet his face flushed with the fever that Clara had been managing for 2 nights, with nothing more than cool cloths and the particular exhaustion of a mother who has not slept watching a sick child. Eric was 4 years old. He was burning. His eyes were half open and he was coughing in short, shallow bursts that shook his whole body. Clara had run 300 yards from her cabin to the south with the boy in her arms when the frame walls of the schoolhouse residence had begun to shake on their foundation sills. She had not knocked on anyone else's door. She had come south because south was where the stone was, and stone was what the mathematics of the moment required. She did not ask whether the silo was safe. She looked at the 20-inch walls and looked at the sealed mortar joints, and looked at the sod roof and made the same calculation that Nora had made 8 months ago in a clearing 40 feet from the river, standing with her palm on the exterior face of the limestone and spreading her fingers as wide as they would go. Mass does not move. She sat down on the floor with Eric in her lap and pulled the quilt tight around him and pressed his face gently into her shoulder. Nora pushed the sleeping platform back against the doorframe. She looked at Clara. "How many are still outside?" "I don't know," Clara said. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when the steadiness is costing something. "I only saw my cabin. I ran." At 4:15 in the afternoon, the first tornado struck Reed's Crossing. The roaring that had been building since 3:30 reached a threshold that was no longer a sound in any ordinary sense, but a physical condition, a pressure state in which normal sound ceased to be audible because the medium through which sound traveled was itself moving at 200 miles an hour. She felt the stove shift. The 200-pound cast-iron box moved 6 inches across the packed earth floor, not because the wind had gotten inside, but because the pressure differential between the sealed interior and the partially open northeast quadrant of the ceiling, where 2 winter-damaged rafter sections had been repaired, but the sod still sat less densely than elsewhere, created a brief internal draft strong enough to slide the iron mass across the clay. The stove stopped when the section of roof above the northeast quadrant partially failed. She heard 2 rafters crack in sequence, the sharp report of rope lashing reaching its load limit and releasing, and then the hollow thud of the poles lifting free and the sod above them shifting and a section of the northeast quadrant opening to the sky. Rain came through immediately cold and driven sideways by the rotating wind. Chunks of sod fell to the floor. The center post held. The remaining 5 rafters held. The wall tops held. The debris began hitting the exterior. The first impacts were light. Fence rails, sections of wooden shutter, the specific clatter of things that had been built from small pieces of wood and were now flying as those small pieces at whatever speed the tornado was moving. Then heavier, a dense concussive thud that sent a crack of stone-transmitted force through the south wall and into her palm. She kept her hand there. Another impact from the north face this time, something large and fast, and the wall communicated the blow through its mass the way it communicated everything, not as displacement, but as vibration, distributing the force across the entire circumference. Simultaneously, every stone in the ring, absorbing its proportional share of what had hit one of them. The wall did not move. What was happening to the frame cabins 300 yards north, she could not see and did not need to see. She could hear it. The sound of a frame building failing under high wind load was entirely distinct from the sound of the wind itself, a sharp rhythmic sequence of concussive cracks that she understood even in the middle of the roaring were the nails pulling free of their plates, the plates tearing from their sills, the wall studs separating at the joints where wood met wood, and the only thing holding the connection was metal driven through organic material that had dried and contracted since the nail was set. In a frame building, the load transferred through the corner connections. The corner connections were nails and mortise joints and the sheer strength of the fasteners. At 200 miles an hour, the fasteners failed. When the fasteners failed, the wall was not a wall anymore. She heard Everett Goss's cabin go. She heard it because it made its own sound under the roaring. The rhythmic crack of each connection, failing in sequence, the timber moving apart the way timber moved when the thing holding it together was no longer strong enough to hold it. She heard the schoolhouse roof lift a wet tearing sound she recognized as the specific noise of a sawed roof separating from its wall plates, the tar paper underneath pulling away in a long tearing note. Eric coughed. Clara held him tighter and pressed his face into her shoulder and rocked him slightly, the automatic motion of a mother keeping a sick child from hearing something that would frighten him more than the fever already had. 12 minutes after the first tornado struck, the second one came. From the northwest this time, documented. The Irving twin tornadoes of May 1879 struck Reed's Crossing from two different compass points within approximately 12 minutes of each other, and anything the first had left standing, the second found from a different angle and applied the same test to, and the test was always the same test, which was the test of the wind against the wall in the question of whether the wall was stronger than the wind's ability to find its weakness and use it. The roaring came back at a different pitch, slightly lower, slightly slower in its rotation, but the speed was indistinguishable from the first. She felt the pressure on the curved limestone. She felt the vibration through the stone. She felt the center post hold and the remaining rafters hold and the wall tops hold, and she sat on the floor with her back against the south wall and her feet braced against the sleeping platform, and she did not move. The second tornado passed. The roaring held for a moment longer, then diminished. Then the wind dropped not to calm, but to the ordinary violence of a severe storm, rain and gusting air, the kind of weather that was simply weather and not an event of a different category entirely. The pressure in her ears equalized. The stove, having moved 6 inches during the pressure differential of the first tornado, did not move again. She listened. She heard Clara's breathing. She heard Eric's cough, the same shallow catch and release pattern it had been before the tornadoes. No worse, no better. The fever maintaining itself regardless of what had happened outside. She heard the rain on the surviving sections of sod roof. She heard the cold front that followed the tornadoes moving in from the northwest, the temperature dropping in the aftermath, the way temperatures dropped after severe storm events on the plains, fast and significant. She heard no voices outside, no cabin walls, no stovepipes, no ordinary sounds of a settlement. She moved the sleeping platform and opened the door. Reed's Crossing was gone, not damaged, not partially standing, gone in the way a sentence is gone when you erase it, not word by word, but all at once, the whole structure simply absent, and the space it had occupied now held by nothing except the sky and the rain. The dirt track that had connected the 14 homesteads was still visible as 2 shallow ruts pressed into the earth because the earth had been pressed that way over years, and the tornado could not unpress it in 12 minutes. But the structures that the track had connected were not visible. The track ran between absences. August Draper's farmhouse and barn were scattered across 200 yards of grass, the lumber lying in the specific chaotic geometry of explosive failure, each piece going the direction the wind had sent it, and landing where gravity retrieved it. The schoolhouse stood as a foundation and a section of north wall to knee height, the rest distributed somewhere to the northeast where the first tornado had carried it. Conrad Vane's general store was a slab floor with the inventory of the past 2 years of Reed's Crossing, commerce scattered across a quarter-mile of prairie, the bolts of cloth and the tin cookware, and the cast iron scale, and the hundreds of paper-wrapped packages dissolving to pulp in the rain that was already reclaiming them. The account ledger, the book in which every debt of every family in the settlement had been recorded in Vane's careful hand, was somewhere in the wet grass, its pages open to the weather. Vane's trespass complaint against Nora Crane, whatever form it had taken, was in that wet grass with everything else. It was never mentioned again. Large limestone blocks, pieces of fieldstone wall from the structures that had incorporated it, lay in the grass 300 feet from where they had stood.